You're listening to the Valley Current.
If I told you about, a startup founder who basically weaponized the press against his rivals, criminalized free speech just to protect his company's brand, and then nearly tore up his own founding operating agreement in this really bitter, paranoid power struggle.
I mean, you would probably assume you were talking about a modern tech CEO, right?
Exactly. Somebody operating out of some glass boardroom in Silicon Valley today. But yep. I'm not. I'm actually talking about the architects of the United States.
It really is a completely different way to view the men we usually see as, these flawless marble statues.
Yeah.
When you strip away all that mythology, the powdered wigs, the fife and drum, you are left with a group of people who are operating exactly like early-stage cutthroat venture capitalists.
Which is wild. So welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We are marking a pretty massive milestone today. The United States semi-quincentennial.
Right, the 250th birthday.
Exactly. 250 years since 1776, hitting us right here in 2026. But if you were expecting typical fireworks and, basic historical trivia, you might want to buckle up.
We're definitely going somewhere completely different.
We are unpacking this really fascinating, highly original legal advisory. It was written by Jack Russo for Computer Law Group, LLP.
And this advisory poses just a brilliant core puzzle. It basically takes two very different recent works and smashes them together to see what sparks fly.
So what are the two works?
Well, on one side, you have the historian Arthur Herman in his book Founders Fire. He argues that America is this project that's perpetually refounded by visionary disruptors.
So like a story of continuous, necessary creative destruction.
Exactly, yeah. But then on the other side, we have this political science paper by Christoph Stees, Kayla Gatehart, and Kristen Olofsson.
And they introduce a much darker concept, right?
Very dark. They introduce this far more cynical figure that they call the polarization entrepreneur.
The polarization entrepreneur.
Right. This is someone who doesn't build anything, but simply profits from toxic division.
So the mission for today's deep dive, the big puzzle we are going to try to solve for you listening, is this. Were the men of 1776 the original Silicon Valley-style tech founders setting the blueprint for modern innovation?
Right.
Or were they history's first polarization entrepreneurs, just burning down the house for their own advantage?
We really need to set the stakes right out of the gate here. This isn't just some parlor trick for a holiday weekend.
No, not at all.
By analyzing the literal structural machinery these men built and holding it up against the venture capital structures of today, we can give you a completely new lens.
I love that.
I mean, this is about tracing an unbroken thread from the 18th century directly to the Sand Hill Road term sheets being signed this very morning.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because I can already hear the skepticism from some people.
Oh, sure.
Are we just slapping a modern Silicon Valley label on 18th century guys wearing wigs just to make history sound cool? Or is there an actual legal linkage here?
There is a very real linkage. But to understand if the founders were tech founders, we have to look at the code they wrote.
And the code of a nation is its constitution.
Exactly. To see the connection, you have to read the text the way a technology lawyer reads a founding document. We have to go straight to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8.
The patent and copyright clause.
Right.
Okay, this is the part that says, Congress has the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries.
That's the one.
I know we've all heard it in civics class, but what makes this specific sentence so revolutionary?
Well, the advisory points out this incredible aha moment hiding in plain sight. There are two structural features that make this the most quietly radical clause in the entire 1787 document.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, look at the phrasing. It is the only enumerated power in the entire Constitution that explicitly states its own purpose.
Wait, really? The only one?
The only one. The framers didn't just grant a power to the government to hand up monopolies, They explicitly declared why they were granting it. To promote the progress.
So they hard-coded the why right into the law.
Precisely. And the second feature is even more staggering, honestly.
Yeah.
In the original 1787 text, and remember, this is years before the Bill of Rights was even drafted, this clause is the very first place the word right appears at all.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Their very first constitutional instinct about defining a right wasn't about the freedom of speech.
It wasn't about religion or the press?
Nope. Their first impulse was to secure intellectual property rights for inventors.
That is genuinely mind-blowing. I mean, it really does function exactly like a venture capital term sheet then.
Let's break down that analogy, actually, because it is incredibly apt. How does a modern term sheet work mechanically?
Well, if I'm a founder pitching a VC, the term sheet outlines the incentive structure. It basically says, here's how we distribute the equity, here is who owns the intellectual property, and here are the governance rules we all agree to follow to make this idea profitable.
Exactly. It's the blueprint for how the imaginary thing becomes a real defensible asset.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what Clause 8 is doing at a national macroeconomic level. I mean, It is the ultimate term sheet.
Right, because it tells the inventor, you get a temporary monopoly, your equity, in exchange for putting your blueprint, your IP, into the public domain where society can eventually benefit from it.
Exactly. They were laying down the incentive structure for an entire innovation economy before they had even finished writing the rest of the nation's bylaws.
And what really amazes me is the speed of execution.
Oh, it was incredibly fast.
In the tech world today, the mantra is always, move fast and break things, or at least move fast and ship the product. The founders was shipping product at lightning speed.
They absolutely were.
The Patent Act of 1790 was the third act of the brand new Congress. President Washington signed it into law in April 1790. That is within 24 months of the Constitution actually being ratified.
It's unheard of. No prior nation had ever placed the legal encouragement of invention so close to its literal foundational bedrock.
Yeah.
It is basically the founder ethos rendered as positive law.
Yeah.
And the personnel who ran it is equally fascinating.
Okay, so this is where Thomas Jefferson enters the picture, acting basically as the first Y Combinator partner.
I love that comparison so much. I mean, what does an accelerator like Y Combinator actually do?
They take a batch of founders with raw, unpolished ideas. The partners sit down with them, review the models, poke holes in the concepts, and they help them refine the pitch into something a venture capitalist will actually fund. They take raw ingenuity and help shape it into a real company.
And that was Thomas Jefferson's literal job description in 1790.
That's just wild to picture.
The advisory notes that, as Secretary of State, Jefferson sat on the very first patent board. He personally reviewed the applications.
Wow.
The modern patent office considers Thomas Jefferson the first administrator of the system and the very first patent examiner.
So he was literally sitting across a wooden table from these early American blacksmiths and engineers.
Evaluating their models, yeah. He was doing exactly what a modern patent prosecutor or seed stage partner does today. He was converting raw, intangible ingenuity into a defensible, financeable asset.
Okay, so they built the mechanism to protect the idea. They established the intellectual property. But, having an idea isn't the same as having a company.
No, it's not.
You can invent the greatest widget in the world, but you need a vehicle to hold that asset, to raise money, to hire people. Yeah. How did they bridge the gap from I have a patent to I have a modern corporation?
Right, so that corporate vehicle came a generation later. But the advisory highlights how it was forged by the exact same philosophical hands. We have to look at 1819.
Okay, 1819.
And a landmark Supreme Court case called Trustees of Dartmouth College v. Woodward.
I remember the name from law school, but walk us through the actual mechanics of what happened. Like, why is a case about a college in New Hampshire the bridge to modern venture capitalism?
It's a really fascinating story of political overreach. So, Dartmouth College was operating under a corporate charter granted years earlier by King George III.
Okay.
In 1816, the state legislature of New Hampshire decided they wanted to take over the private college and turn it into a state university.
Wait, they just decided to take it?
Yeah. They literally passed a law trying to rewrite the college's charter and replace the board of trustees with their own political appointees.
So the state just swoops in and says, we don't like how you're running this private entity, so we are taking your underlying paperwork and rewriting it to put ourselves in charge.
Exactly. And think about the implications of that. If a state government has the power to do that, to unilaterally seize a private organization and change its ownership structure, then the entire concept of private enterprise is basically dead on arrival.
Because nobody is going to invest capital into a business if the local governor can just wake up one morning and seize the board of directors.
Right. So the college sued, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Marshall delivered the ruling.
What was Marshall's logic?
Well, he ruled that a corporate charter is fundamentally a contract. And under the Contracts Clause of the U.S. Constitution, a state government is prohibited from impairing a contract.
So they couldn't just change the terms.
Exactly. And Marshall defined the corporation in this incredibly poetic, legally profound way. He called it an artificial being, invisible, intangible, and existing only in contemplation of law.
An artificial being, existing only in contemplation of law. That is such a wild concept when you really think about it.
It is the conceptual leap that makes modern capitalism possible, honestly.
Marshall's ruling meant that a corporate charter was protected property.
Like a force field around private enterprise.
Exactly. By declaring that the state could not arbitrarily break that contract, he made the American Business Corporation a durable, predictable, investable thing. So what does this all mean for you listening right now? If you work for a startup, or you are an angel investor, or you are just, reading the financial news over coffee.
Yeah.
Every single Delaware C Corp formed this morning, every tech giant in Silicon Valley, is a direct, lineal descendant of John Marshall's logic in that 1819 ruling.
They didn't just write a political constitution. They systematically built the entire legal scaffolding of an innovation economy from absolute scratch.
But that brings us to a really fascinating tension in the source material. Because, okay, they built the legal machinery to protect IP and shield corporations, but how did these specific men actually feel about intellectual property on a personal level?
Right, because they weren't just disinterested lawyers writing abstract theory in a vacuum. They were active inventors themselves.
And here is where it gets really interesting, because when you look at their personal actions, it turns out they were arguing about the exact same fundamental philosophies that modern software developers fight about today.
Oh, completely.
We are talking about the philosophical war between open source sharing and proprietary closed system models. Let's look at Benjamin Franklin.
A massively prolific inventor.
Unbelievably prolific. I mean, he invented the lightning rod, bifocal glasses, the Franklin stove. These were world-changing, highly lucrative inventions. But did he patent them?
Nope.
No, he refused to patent any of them. The governor of Pennsylvania literally approached Franklin and offered him an exclusive, highly profitable patent on the Franklin stove, and Franklin turned it down flat.
Why? What was the underlying mechanism of his refusal?
He explained it in his autobiography. He wrote, and I'm quoting here, "As we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours, and this we should do freely and generously."
Which is the exact ideological underpinning of the open source software movement today.
He is the 18th century godfather of open source. It's the exact same ethos as releasing a piece of code onto GitHub for free so the community can build on it.
Yeah, Franklin really believed that restricting the idea hurt the collective progress. But then, on the other hand, you have Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
Jefferson administered the patent office, he handed out the monopolies, but as the advisory notes, he harbored a deep, profound ambivalence about the very concept of locking up an idea.
How so? Like, what was his issue with it?
Well, this is where we get one of the most penetrating descriptions of the economics of information ever written, honestly. In 1813, Jefferson wrote a letter to an inventor named Isaac McPherson.
Okay.
Jefferson was trying to articulate the fundamental difference between physical property and intellectual property. He wrote about the action of the thinking power, called an idea.
Okay, I like that phrasing.
And he used this beautiful analogy. He said, "He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me."
He who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me. That is sheer poetry.
It is poetry, but you have to look at the economic reality underneath the poetry. Jefferson is essentially defining the marginal cost of zero nature of digital goods 2 full centuries before the invention of the internet.
Let's make sure that concept is totally clear for everyone. The marginal cost of zero.
Think about it mechanically. If I build a wooden chair and you come along and take my chair, I now have 0 chairs.
Right. Physical property is a zero-sum game.
Exactly. The marginal cost of producing a second wooden chair requires more wood, more time, more labor. But an idea is completely different.
Right, because if I have a blueprint for a chair and I share that idea with you, you have the idea, but I also still have the idea.
My light is not darkened because I shared it.
It's the exact mechanism of software. When you copy a line of code or, when you download this deep dive right now, you aren't depriving anyone else of the code or the audio file.
The cost to distribute one more copy is essentially 0. Jefferson saw that essential strangeness of intellectual property so clearly in 1813.
Okay, so you have Franklin actively practicing open source development and Jefferson theorizing the zero marginal cost economics of information. But what about the other side of the spectrum?
Right. What about the people who believe deeply in the proprietary model, the financial incentive?
This brings us to a pretty surprising historical cameo in the text. Abraham Lincoln.
Obviously not a founder of 1776, but Arthur Herman frames Lincoln as the paradigmatic founder-statesman who preserved and validated the original machine.
Right. And Lincoln had a very hands-on relationship with this machinery. I didn't know this, but he's the only U.S. president in history to ever hold a patent.
Yep.
It was patent number 6,469, granted in 1849 for a mechanical device meant to buoy vessels over shallow shoals. And Lincoln had a very famous perspective on why the patent system was brilliant.
What did he say?
He said that patents added the fuel of interest to the fire of genius.
The fuel of interest to the fire of genius. Take that logic one step further. That phrase is not just a nice rhetorical flourish.
No.
It is the ultimate theory of incentives. What is the mechanism there?
It is the literal definition of a cap table. I mean, if I have an incredible idea, the fire of genius, but I have no money, the idea dies.
Exactly.
A capitalization table in a modern startup is how you distribute the equity, the risk, and the reward. You give the founder, the engineers, and the investors a direct financial interest, the fuel, so they will actually kill themselves working 80-hour weeks to build the thing.
Lincoln recognized that genius alone isn't enough, right? Genius needs the financial fuel to manifest in the real world.
So when you look at that whole spectrum, you have Franklin demonstrating the power of giving it away, Jefferson philosophizing about the nature of information, and Lincoln explaining the necessity of equity incentives.
These men didn't just build the legal framework, they mapped out the entire spectrum of modern technological thought before the light bulb was even invented.
It's incredible. But, if the founders set the incentives so perfectly and built this amazing machine, what happens when the things they build become massive, entrenched institutions?
No.
What happens when the startup becomes a monopoly? This is where Arthur Herman's core thesis in Founders Fire really takes over the narrative.
Yes, Herman's central device is a historical dialectic. He argues that founders, whether we are talking about nation builders or tech CEOs, create things through first principles thinking.
Okay, so they look at a broken system, ignore all the established rules, and build something entirely new.
Exactly. But then a necessary transition happens. The founders step back and the managers take over.
Because you can't run a global empire on pure chaos and disruption forever. You need payroll, you need HR, you need logistics.
Exactly. The managers systematize the founders' vision, they scale it, they institutionalize it. But Herman points out the fatal flaw in this cycle.
Which is?
In time, that management layer always ossifies. The focus shifts from how do we build something new to how do we protect the existing revenue stream. The institution becomes stagnant.
And that stagnation is what summons the next generation of founders to tear the whole thing down and start over.
It is a profoundly humanized version of the economist Joseph Schumpeter's concept of creative destruction.
Okay, let's do a quick level set on Schumpeter because that term gets thrown around a lot in business podcasts. But what is the actual mechanical theory there?
So Schumpeter was an Austrian political economist, and he argued that the essential fact of capitalism is not equilibrium or steady growth.
It's not.
No, it is a perennial gale of destruction. He said that the new thing necessarily has to annihilate the old thing.
Oh, like the automobile doesn't just compete with the horse-drawn carriage, it destroys the buggy whip industry entirely.
Exactly. The digital camera destroys Kodak.
Streaming destroys Blockbuster.
Right. But Schumpeter also warned of a tragic turn. He feared that capitalism might eventually be killed by its own success.
So?
He worried that the routinizing bureaucrat, the conscious manager, would eventually displace the disruptive entrepreneur entirely, leading to total stagnation.
And Arthur Herman is taking Schumpeter's insight and running it across the entire timeline of American history.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I see how that works historically, but how does this map to modern business structure? Because we see this exact founder-to-manager transition happening in Silicon Valley every single day.
We do, and modern management scholarship has documented the mechanics of it very cleanly. The advisory cites Noam Wasserman, who studied about 10,000 founders.
Wow, 10,000.
Yeah, and Wasserman derived what he calls the rich versus king dilemma.
The rich versus king dilemma, I love that framing. How does that trade-off work?
It is a trade-off between control and growth. Founders who insist on being king meaning they refuse to give up any control of the board, they refuse to delegate, they want to make every decision, they tend to keep a tight grip on their company.
But they capture significantly less financial value. Right.
Exactly. The company's growth is bottlenecked by the founder's own limitations.
And the rich path.
The founders who choose to get rich are the ones who willingly cede control. They step aside and bring in professional managers, the operational experts who know how to scale a company globally.
Right.
They build vastly larger, more profitable companies. But the trade-off is they are frequently displaced from their own creations. They get rich, but they lose the throne.
It's the classic boardroom conversation. Listen, you are a brilliant visionary, you built an amazing prototype, but we need an adult in the room to run global supply chains.
Yes, exactly. And Steve Blank, another prominent voice in this space, has studied this exact visionary versus operations successor dynamic.
What did he find?
Blank points out a recurring pattern. When the operations-minded successor takes over, they are brilliant at maximizing current profits. But they systematically miss the next wave of innovation because they are managing risk, not taking it.
The advisory uses Microsoft as a prime example of this, right?
It is the perfect illustration. Think about the Steve Ballmer era and Microsoft. Ballmer was an operations and sales genius.
Yeah.
Under his management, Microsoft was highly profitable, with a cash-generating machine. But strategically, it was completely becalmed.
They missed everything. I mean, they missed search engines, they missed the smartphone revolution, they missed mobile operating systems, digital music, and they were incredibly late to cloud computing.
Exactly. The manager systematized the existing cash cows, Windows and Office, but they lost the capacity to invent the future.
So it required a new, disruptive, founder-like turn under Satya Nadella to completely renew the company's culture and product lines.
The manager maintained the fortress, but it took a return to a founder mindset to actually innovate again.
That makes total sense. Now, if the cycle is continuous, founder builds, manager stagnates, new founder destroys, I want to look at the moment the modern tech version of this cycle really ignited.
Let's do it.
I want to shift the narrative to Mountain View, California in 1957, because the source text argues that the deepest proof of this entire thesis sits right there.
Ah, the story of the traitorous eight. It is the foundational myth of Silicon Valley.
Yes. Let's get into the mechanics of why this happened. Imagine working for a boss who is undeniably brilliant. He literally just won the Nobel Prize in physics. But he is so notoriously paranoid, so micromanaging, that he actually forces his employees to take lie detector tests over minor office disputes.
That was William Shockley at Shockley Semiconductor.
Shockley is the classic example of brilliant technical vision combined with fatal managerial flaws.
He had assembled the greatest collection of scientific talent in the world, but his management style was suffocating them.
And it wasn't just a lie detector test, it was a fundamental product disagreement, wasn't it?
Right. Shockley was obsessed with developing something called a four-layer diode, while his top engineers realized the real future was in the silicon transistor.
And he just refused to listen to them. He was acting as the bottleneck king.
So what did the engineers do?
8 of his top engineers secretly reached out to an investment banker on the East Coast named Arthur Rock. They essentially said, "We have the talent, we know what the future is, but we can't build it under this management structure." Arthur Rock connected them with an industrialist named Sherman Fairchild, who provided the capital. And in one fell swoop, those 8 engineers walked out the door, abandoned William Shockley, and founded Fairchild Semiconductor.
That single act of disloyalty, that walkout, is basically the Big Bang of modern Silicon Valley.
The ripple effect is absolutely staggering. From that one company, Fairchild, you get the founders of Intel.
You get the founders of AMD.
You get Eugene Kleiner, who goes on to help invent the modern venture capital model itself at Kleiner Perkins.
The advisory actually points out that the Computer History Museum traced the family tree of those 8 engineers to more than 90 publicly traded companies.
And what was the aggregate market value of those descendants?
Over $2 trillion.
$2 trillion created just because 8 guys looked at a stagnant management structure and said, we can build this better ourselves.
It is the exact founding gesture of 1776, the exact same middle finger to King George, repeated in a Mountain View office park in 1957.
It is a phenomenal story, but the source material asks us to pause here and recognize a profound irony, one that the rebel mythology of Silicon Valley often conveniently obscures.
What's the irony?
This whole anti-establishment narrative, the idea of the maverick founders in a garage taking on the world completely alone, is largely a myth.
Oh, absolutely. That entire ecosystem was actually midwifed and sustained by massive, deeply entrenched establishment institutions.
Right. They weren't just operating in a total vacuum. They had help.
Massive help. The early Silicon Valley ecosystem was deliberately nurtured by Stanford University under the guidance of Dean Frederick Terman.
Right. He actively encouraged his engineering students to start companies locally rather than moving to the East Coast.
And even more importantly, the early survival of these companies was heavily backed by decades of federal and defense demand. The government was their first and best customer.
You're talking about the military contracts for missile guidance systems, the massive government funding that eventually created the ARPANET, which became the internet.
Exactly. The first principles, rebel and the enabling state, are not opposites in this story. They are deeply symbiotic partners.
The rebel needs the infrastructure to build on top of.
And this brings us full circle to the founders of 1776. They understood this symbiosis perfectly.
They built the government structures, the patent office, the contract law, the corporate charter under John Marshall. That became the container.
Right.
They built the safe, predictable environment where private genius could actually compound and grow without being crushed by the state.
But this brings us to a massive, uncomfortable pivot in the advisory's analysis. We have spent this whole time looking at the founders as brilliant, disruptive tech visionaries.
Right.
But what if this constant disruption, this endless rebel energy, is actually deeply toxic?
Right. What if burning things down isn't always a creative act? This is where we bring in the counter-argument from the other source text, the political science paper by Steeves, Gabehart, and Olafson.
Right. And they introduced this concept of the polarization entrepreneur.
Let's define this term very carefully because it is the linchpin of the critical argument.
According to the political scientists, a polarization entrepreneur is a political or social actor whose primary aim is not to resolve a specific policy conflict.
They aren't trying to fix a problem.
No. Their goal is to advance broader strategic goals, like solidifying their own power base, raising money, or gaining electoral advantage by deliberately, intentionally deepening division.
They basically manufacture outrage as a business model.
Yes. They mobilize an intense us versus them mentality. The authors build on a concept that scholars call pernicious polarization.
So this isn't just normal, healthy political disagreement.
Not at all. Pernicious polarization is the division of a society into mutually distrustful, deeply hostile camps where the other side isn't just wrong, they are an existential threat.
Okay, before we go any further down this path, I want to make something crystal clear for everyone listening.
Good idea.
We are taking this historical and academic framework from the source material and using it purely as an analytical tool. We are remaining entirely neutral on modern politics, whether left-wing or right-wing.
Absolutely.
Our goal today is strictly to convey the ideas contained in this advisory and see how they apply to the specific men of 1776.
That is a vital impartiality check.
Yeah.
Because the honest analytical question we have to ask is, do the American founders actually fit the definition of polarization entrepreneurs?
If you look at their behavior, were they just toxic dividers?
Well, wait, hold on. When we think of toxic polarization today, we think of 247 algorithmic social media.
Sure.
We think of literal supercomputers in our pockets, specifically engineered in a lab to make our blood pressure spike so we keep scrolling and clicking ads.
Right, so you were telling me a bunch of guys in powdered wigs writing letters with literal bird feathers managed to be more toxic than what we experience today.
I am telling you they were absolutely ruthlessly toxic. We have to look at the historical mechanics of what they actually did in the 1790s.
Okay.
The decade after the Constitution was ratified was viciously polarized. I mean, it makes modern political Twitter look polite.
Give me the mechanics. How bad was it?
It started with the press.
Yeah.
The 1790s gave us the very first fiercely partisan newspaper wars.
Right.
You had Alexander Hamilton sitting in the cabinet, secretly funding the Gazette of the United States to attack his rivals.
Wow.
And Thomas Jefferson sitting in the exact same cabinet, secretly funding the National Gazette to brutally attack Hamilton and George Washington. They were paying journalists to destroy each other's reputations.
So basically the 18th century equivalent of funding a network of bot accounts to smear your co-founder?
Yes. But it went far beyond just mean articles. They actually weaponized the power of the federal government against their political enemies.
Oh, you're talking about the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798.
Exactly.
What was the actual mechanism of those acts?
Under a federalist control government led by John Adams, they literally criminalized criticism of the federal government itself.
That's crazy.
They made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. And they used this law to actively prosecute opposition newspaper editors.
Didn't they even go after politicians?
They did. They even prosecuted a sitting member of Congress, Matthew Lyon of Vermont. He was thrown in a literal dungeon for criticizing the president, and he actually won his re-election campaign from his jail cell.
That is absolute madness. Prosecuting journalists and jailing congressmen just for criticizing the executive branch.
And all of this venom culminated in the election of 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. The rhetoric was apocalyptic.
Yeah.
Both sides genuinely believed that if the other side won, the American experiment was over and the country would descend into blood and anarchy. The system was so stressed it nearly broke the young constitutional order entirely.
So if the test of a polarization entrepreneur is just dividing people to conquer them, then the founding generation passes with flying colors.
They really do.
I mean, they were incredibly polarizing. They weaponized the press, they weaponized the law, they look exactly like toxic dividers.
But here is the major analytical turning point in the source material. Did they pass the test of being polarization entrepreneurs in the corrosive modern sense of the word?
Right. Is there a difference?
The defining difference, the absolute crux of the entire advisory's argument, is the outcome.
What do you mean by the outcome?
A polarization entrepreneur, in the precise academic sense defined by Steves and his colleagues, does not aim to resolve conflict. Division is the actual product they are selling.
Division is the end goal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the problem gets solved, they lose their power base. But the founders, for all their bitter, nasty, deeply personal viciousness toward one another, channeled their conflict into construction.
Okay, let's unpack that synthesis. What did that massive amount of friction actually build?
Look at the structural outputs. Their arguments over federal versus state power built the Constitution itself. Their bitter arguments over individual rights forced the creation of the Bill of Rights. Their newspaper wars built the first functioning political party system.
And most importantly, the apocalyptic election of 1800 resulted in the world's first peaceful transfer of executive power between bitter rivals in the modern world.
In 1801, John Adams, despite hating Thomas Jefferson, handed over the keys to the government and went home to Massachusetts.
They weaponized division, yes, but they weaponized it the way a venture is weaponized by market competition.
Exactly.
So if a modern polarization entrepreneur is just burning down the house for engagement farming, you're saying the founders were burning down the house to clear the lot for a new foundation.
That's a great way to put it. I love how the advisory frames this distinction. They polarized in the service of building.
Right.
The modern polarizer divides as a substitute for building.
Yeah.
That is not just a difference of degree, that is a fundamental difference of kind. The founders' friction birthed a durable, living machine.
That is such a powerful lens. But this entire conversation forces us to ask a much deeper, more philosophical question about human nature and how history actually works.
It does.
Do great visionary individuals force these structures into existence through sheer force of will? Or does the environment, the ecosystem, the technology, the economics just spit out the right person at the right time because the conditions demand it?
Ah, you are touching on the classic great man theory of history.
Right. How does the advisory tackle that debate?
It outlines the two opposing philosophical poles. On one side, you have the Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle. In 1841, Carlyle gave the heroic view its most famous motto.
What did he say?
He wrote, "The history of the world is but the biography of great men."
That is pure, unadulterated Silicon Valley founder mythology right there.
Exactly.
It is the belief that a Steve Jobs or an Elon Musk or a Thomas Jefferson single-handedly bends reality to their individual will. If they hadn't been born, the iPhone or the Declaration of Independence would simply never exist.
Right. But then you have the rebuttal, provided a generation later by the English philosopher Herbert Spencer.
What was Spencer's counter-argument?
Spencer insisted that society makes the man. He argued that before a great person can remake their world, their society must first make them.
Okay, so this is the structural environmental account of history.
Yes. It looks at the underlying conditions. The property regimes, the available capital markets, the immigration flows, the government funding.
Right.
Spencer's view says the ecosystem created the opportunity, the pressure was building, and someone, somewhere, was bound to fill the vacuum.
It is the difference between saying Steve Jobs uniquely invented the smartphone out of thin air versus saying microchip processing power, battery density, and cellular networks reached a critical mass where someone was inevitably going to invent a glass rectangle that connects to the internet.
Precisely. So how does the source text resolve this tension between the heroic founder and the inevitable ecosystem?
It brings in a brilliant 1943 synthesis by the American philosopher Sidney Hook.
I love Sidney Hook's terminology here. The advisory breaks it down to two very distinct types of historical figures. First, Hook identifies the eventful man.
Let's define the eventful man mechanically. This is someone who simply happened to be standing at the intersection when history turned.
Right, they were at the right place at the right time, holding the winning lottery ticket.
If they hadn't been there, someone else standing next to them would have done essentially the exact same thing.
And then Hook contrasts that with the event-making man.
How is that different?
Hook argues that an event-making person is someone whose actions flow from outstanding capacities of intelligence, will, and character.
So they don't just ride the historical wave, they actively create the turning point.
Exactly. Their specific, unique involvement fundamentally alters the trajectory of the event in a way that someone else wouldn't have. And the advisory argues forcefully that the founders were unequivocally event-making.
Because the raw materials were there, right?
Right.
The Enlightenment philosophy, the English common law, the geographic distance from London, those were all available in the ether.
But it took particular men possessing very specific, highly unusual capacities to build these specific institutions in this incredibly durable form at that exact hinge of history.
Exactly. But we have to pause here. The source material introduces a highly critical nuance at this point, an intellectual honesty check about who actually got the chance to be an event-making man in the 18th century.
Yes, this is crucial. A thesis that celebrates the founder's spirit and the genius of the machine has to reckon with the historical reality of the era.
Definitely.
The advisory explicitly notes that for most of American history, the category of people who were legally and socially free to found anything was incredibly narrow.
It was overwhelmingly white, it was exclusively male, and it required a certain baseline of property and wealth.
And we must acknowledge the glaring truth that many of the most celebrated founders, the men writing the rules about liberty and property, were themselves slaveholders, actively depriving others of both.
You cannot just mythologize the brilliance of the machine without acknowledging the profound, glaring exclusions built into its initial launch.
Furthermore, the advisory points out a massive survivorship bias at play in how we view history.
Explain that.
We canonize the founders who won. We study the men who built the system we currently live inside. But we often completely forget the equally audacious, brilliant founders, rebels, and thinkers who tried to build different systems and failed, or who were crushed by the system that won.
But the advisory makes a really fascinating analytical point here. Recognizing this historical exclusion, admitting our deep survivorship bias, and acknowledging the moral blind spots of these men does not actually weaken the core argument about their mechanical genius.
How does it strengthen it, though?
Well, by stripping away the marble statue hero worship, by acknowledging the deep flaws and the narrowness of the playing field, we can actually see the mechanics of what they built much more clearly.
Right, we aren't blinded by mythology.
Exactly. We can look at the Constitution the way a mechanic looks at an engine. We see it as a tool, a technology, rather than a sacred fairy tale.
That is a profound point. It grounds the history in cold reality, which allows us to actually use it as a predictive tool today.
Which brings us perfectly to the present moment. How do we apply this 250-year-old framework to the disruptors, the politicians, and the tech CEOs we see operating today?
This is the ultimate test of the advisory. The source texts give us two competing lenses to look at the modern age, what Arthur Herman explicitly calls the age of Trump, and the current era of modern tech founders entering the highest levels of government.
And again, to everyone listening, we are maintaining strict neutrality here. We are just laying out the structural frameworks provided by the authors.
Lens 1 comes from Arthur Herman. This is the affirmative, optimistic reading.
Okay, so what does this lens see?
This lens casts the massive disruption of the current era, the rule-breaking, the tearing down of established norms, the aggressive rhetoric as a necessary renewing force.
It is the founder mode being applied to a deeply ossified, stagnant administrative state.
In this view, the disruptor is the harsh, necessary cure for institutional decay.
But lens 2 comes from Stiefs and his colleagues. This is the highly critical reading.
What's their take?
The slice looks at that exact same disruption and sees not renewal, but the polarization entrepreneur at work.
Right.
It sees division being weaponized purely for strategic advantage, to rile up a base, to raise funds, without any underlying intention of building a new, better, or more durable structure afterward.
And here is where the political science gives us a very sobering mathematical empirical check. The advisory cites a 2020 academic study by researchers Graham and Svolik.
Let's dig into the mechanics of this study because the numbers are shocking.
The researchers wanted to measure how much voters actually care about democratic norms versus partisan loyalty. They found that only a tiny fraction of American voters, by their broader, more generous estimate, only about 3.5%, are willing to cross party lines to punish their own candidate for violating democratic rules or constitutional norms.
Why 3.5%?
Yeah.
That means that 96.5% of highly partisan voters will actively watch their own candidate break the rules of the system, and they will still vote for them anyway simply because they perceive the other side as a worse alternative.
Exactly. The sheer force of partisanship completely blunts the public's defense of the rules themselves. The voters will not punish the rule breaker if the rule breaker is wearing their team's jersey.
So what does that mean mechanically for the system?
It asks a profound, almost terrifying question of the listener. If the general public will not defend the rules of the game, where does the check on a toxic polarization entrepreneur actually come from?
If there is no market punishment for toxic division, what stops the division from destroying the host?
That is the million-dollar question. Does the check come from the judicial branch? From the financial markets withdrawing capital? From the press?
Or does it have to come from the founder's original institutional design itself?
Right.
Is the machinery, the separation of powers, the contractual protections, the First Amendment, is that machine strong enough to withstand people who just want to break it for engagement?
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis for the innovators, the lawyers, the founders, and the citizens listening to this deep dive today. This is the final test for any modern disruptor.
Whether you are in Washington, D.C. trying to rewrite federal policy, or you are on Sand Hill Road pitching a venture capitalist on a startup that wants to upend an entire global industry.
The test is Sidney Hook's test. It is not whether you have the power or the volume to break the existing order.
Breaking things is relatively easy. Any polarization entrepreneur can do it.
Right. The ultimate test of whether you are an event-making founder is whether what you build in its place will still be standing in 250 years.
The founder builds, the polarizer merely divides. That is such a clarifying distinction.
It really is.
Disruption that actually endures has to eventually build defensible, transferable, lawful structures. It has to build patents, contracts, institutions, and mechanisms for progress, not just anger.
That was the true founder's fire in 1776. It wasn't just the rhetoric of revolution, it was the meticulous construction of the machinery that followed. And if we take the advisory's point seriously, that is the founder's fire still.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the semi-quincentennial, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've discussed today.
Okay, let's hear it.
We talked earlier about how the entire point of the original Constitutional Patent Clause 8 was a specific bargain. You get a temporary monopoly, but in exchange, you must provide the public disclosure of the invention.
Right, you get to own it for a bit, but you have to show the world exactly how the machine works so human progress can continue.
It's the taper Jefferson talked about. You get the protection, but you have to light the world with the knowledge.
Exactly.
So here's the question for you to consider. If that public disclosure was the fundamental bedrock bargain of American innovation, is modern tech's heavy reliance on dark, hidden trade secrecy, where the world's most powerful algorithms and AI models are locked away in black boxes, never to be disclosed to the public? Is that a fulfillment of the founder's original bargain? Or is it a quiet, complete betrayal of the very machine they built?
That is a phenomenal question to end on.
Led by Jack Russo, Computer Law Group LLP is a bespoke business litigation and founder-friendly boutique law firm with offices and licensed attorneys in Silicon Valley, New York, and Tampa Bay. And you can reach Jack at computerlaw.com and his team at www.computerlaw.com, where the newsletter we referred to is published in detail and readily available commitment-free with no paywalls or other charges.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.